Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our presentation of Burnside Unbound, where we bring our author events to you in the comfort of your own home. My name is Kate, and tonight I'm privileged to chat with author Tania Blanchard. Welcome, Tania.
Thank you so much, Kate, for having me. And hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me this evening as I talk about letters from Berlin.
So to begin with, I'd just like to quickly acknowledge that this land we meet upon virtually is the traditional land of the Ghana people, and we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. Now, a big thank you to our attendees zooming in to our conversation with Tania this evening. If you would like me to ask Tania a question on your behalf, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and type in your question. If you can't see the icon, then just let your cursor hover over the bottom of the Zoom screen and you'll see that icon pop up. So tonight, Tania's going to give us a comprehensive presentation, and then she will open up the floor, so to speak, for questions from our viewers. So grab your cuppa or a glass of wine and sit back and relax and enjoy. So Tania, again, thank you so much for your time this evening. And I have to start by congratulating you on 2 milestones. Firstly, your first 2 novels have now sold over 100,000 copies. And secondly, the launch of your new novel, Letters from Berlin.
Thank you so much, Kate. Yes, I'm very, very privileged to be able to have 3 books out there, 3 wonderful family stories, and the fact that both The Girl from Munich and Suitcase of Dreams have sold over 100,000 copies is testament to the fact that people have connected with these stories, and I feel very blessed and very honoured that has happened.
Excellent. Well, if you would like to start your presentation, that would be wonderful.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you. Everyone, I've got a slideshow that I'm going to just turn on now. So bear with me just a second while I do that. Okay. Okay, right. Okay. So I'd like to start. This slide that you all see now is a beautiful photo of my grandmother, who inspired my first 2 books and also to some degree Letters from Berlin. This is my favourite photo of her as a young woman. So look, I've always been inspired by family stories and how they fit into our history. I grew up listening to my German grandmother tell us about her life in Germany during World War II and the Allied occupation, about her family's migration to Australia in the 1950s and their early days in Sydney. She was always larger than life to me, and I knew that one day I wanted to tell her story, which resulted in me writing The Girl from Munich and Suitcase of Dreams. So they're the first 2 books. While researching The Girl from Munich and sifting through the documents, photos, and memorabilia that my German grandmother left behind after she died, I discovered the letter that started the journey to Letters from Berlin. The letter had been sent to her when she was in her 80s by newly connected relatives in Germany. They'd been trying to find other branches of the family that had dispersed after the war and had found my grandmother's cousin, recently returned to Germany after spending nearly 40 years living in South America, where his mother's family had migrated in the early 1900s. So as you can see here, there's the box of treasures that my grandmother left behind, and some lovely family photos and letters. It was pretty remarkable to find all this information. Okay, so here in this slide, you'll see photos that came with the letter, and they're photos of my grandmother's cousin. On the left there, you'll see him as a young boy, and then on the right as an old man. So this cousin wrote them a short letter in response to their inquiry about his family. He remembered meeting my grandmother's brothers on their way to the war, never returning from the Eastern Front, where they both perished. He lost contact with the family after his father's death. It was wonderful to discover a part of my grandmother's family that I knew nothing about. But the icing on the cake was a copy of a German newspaper article that accompanied the letter. Okay, this is the newspaper article. As you can see, it's in German. So I had no idea what it was about until I began translating it. That article blew my mind. It briefly covered the story of this cousin's family from the 1920s through to the late 1940s, so the war years in Germany and then into the Soviet occupation. The reason his story was so sensational was because he was involved in a landmark legal case in Germany in an attempt to reclaim property lost to his family at the end of the war. The legal case took over 20 years from first lodgement, reaching the Supreme Court in Germany. The final verdict was a resounding victory, handed down when he was lying in hospital. His courage, determination, and persistence finally paid off. He died 2 weeks later. Besides being an incredible story, the amazing thing for me was to learn more about my family. I discovered that my grandmother's uncle was married to a Jewish woman originally from Russia. So you can see another wonderful photo here. This is my grandmother's uncle and his Jewish wife. They look like quite a distinguished couple. So this uncle owned a large estate outside of Berlin, and he was predominantly a timber merchant. His wife's name was added to the Register of Jews in 1943, sparking off a series of events that changed their lives, despite all he had done to protect them from Nazi persecution. So I couldn't believe everything this family, my relatives, had endured. It's such an incredible story, full of heartbreak, survival, and human endurance, and it made me immensely proud, and I knew immediately that I wanted to tell their story. So Letters from Berlin is inspired by the life of my grandmother's cousin and follows the story of a mixed marriage family, Jewish and German, during World War II in Germany and then into the Soviet occupation. So the story is set in and around Berlin, and Susie's world is turned upside down when Elia, her godmother and guardian, has finally been placed on the official register of Jews and must now wear the Star of David. Her godfather, Georg, has been able to protect Elia and their son, Leo, through good relationships with prominent Nazis until now. When a family friend and influential Nazi offers to help protect Elia and Leo, Susie jumps at the chance. She'll do whatever she can to protect her family and the man she loves. As they turn to the resistance to thwart the Nazis in any way they can, and the risk to Elia and Leo escalates, Susie learns how far she'll have to go to keep her family safe. Unlike the previous novels, where I had wonderful family stories, photos, documents, and memorabilia to draw on, with Letters from Berlin, all I had to begin with was a letter that was sent to my grandmother and the German newspaper article that accompanied it. Fortunately, because this cousin's case was so high profile and the progress of his legal case was reported in a number of German newspapers over the years, I had lots to draw on. Thankfully, there were enough details about the significant moments in his and his family's lives, and that I could research on that further, investigating the historical events surrounding these moments. I was able to gather additional details from census information and immigration records from the Ancestry website, corroborating the newspaper articles. I drew on fascinating first-hand accounts of the time from books and biographies, a fabulous array of information from the internet. Where would we be without that? I watched lots of documentaries and returned to my trusted tomes written by historians about World War II. Research provided further layers to the story and helped build a picture of what family and legacy meant in the climate of the Third Reich and in 1943, with Germany's first big loss in the war on the Eastern Front at Stalingrad and the final solution well underway. It also gave me an indication as to what extent people were prepared to go to protect the ones they loved. Using the pivotal experiences of this family as anchor points in the novel, I was able to join the dots to construct an authentic story, weaving fact and research about what their lives might have been like, with fiction to bring this family story to life. Letters from Berlin is told from the perspective of a fictional foster daughter of Georg and Elia. The facts I had provided the scaffold for the novel, and the fictional storyline of Susie and Julius have added layers to the story of war, to the exploration of how this group of people experienced the war, and to what extent people were prepared to go to protect the ones they loved. I wanted to tell this story from a female's point of view, an ordinary German girl looking in at the war, experienced by a rarely mentioned group of people. Those Jewish people married to Germans in mixed marriages, and their children who were considered Mischling, half-breeds, like my grandmother's cousin. I knew virtually nothing about this group of people and how they survived the Holocaust and navigated their way through the war. According to the Holocaust Encyclopedia, in 1933, the Jewish population of Berlin was about 160,000. Berlin's Jewish community was the largest, with more than 32% of all Jewish people in Germany. Many emigrated through the 1930s due to Nazi persecution, and Berlin's Jewish population fell to half, about 80,000, by 1939. By October of 1941, Jewish Berliners were being deported from Nazi Germany to the eastern ghettos, the largest being Warsaw and Lodz. By 1942, these ghettos began to be liquidated, with their inmates deported to extermination camps, such as Auschwitz, Belzec, and Treblinka, and many Jewish people still within the Third Reich were deported directly to such camps in the east. The deportations from Berlin ended by April 1943. The city was empty of Jews. More than 60,000 had been deported from Berlin. Only a small number remained in the city and survived the war, some hiding, but the majority in mixed marriages. In this slide, you can see here the classifications of Jewish heritage. So you start with someone who has no Jewish grandparents, someone with one Jewish grandparent, two Jewish grandparents, three, and then obviously 4 Jewish grandparents meant you were fully Jewish. And those different classifications meant that you were treated differently and you were given different rights. So I'll just explain a little bit about that now. So German law actually protected Jewish spouses in mixed marriages, even with the new Nazi laws and rulings. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 redefined race law, persecuting those who had Jewish blood, rescinding their German citizenship and forbidding marriage or relationships with Germans. There were so many rulings that arose out of these laws, especially after Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass. And that was in 1938, when Jewish synagogues were torched, businesses vandalized, and many Jewish people were arrested. Although Jews were no longer allowed to marry Germans, there were many mixed marriages that already existed, and the laws were not retroactive. Many couples were pressured to divorce, but many didn't. Jewish women who were married to German men and did not practice their faith and baptized their children as Christian, usually Lutheran, like my relatives, were considered to be in privileged marriages, which allowed them the status and privileges of a German family, including full rations, being allowed to stay in their homes, and not wearing the Star of David. However, unprivileged marriages, Jewish men married to German women or with children brought up in the Jewish faith, although protected to some extent, were treated less favourably. Many in such families lost their jobs and were ostracised by their community, their friends, and even their family. Christian children with a German father were also considered German citizens, but as the war began and then escalated, the restrictions on this group rose. Already forbidden to have a relationship or marry a German, they were then unable to join the military and attend university, among other restrictions. But by 1943, when my story begins, all bets were off and everything changed. The final solution to rid Germany and Europe of the Jews was underway. And as the end of the war and Germany's loss loomed closer, the more desperate the Nazis' attempts to ensure no Jews were spared became. So although not in immediate threat of deportation to the eastern ghettos and extermination camps of occupied Poland, their lives were tenuous, and the threat to their very survival was a real and present danger. By autumn 1944, there was a major drive to recruit Mischling or half-Jews into the labour camps to supply forced labour for the Nazi civil engineering and construction projects. These included building roads, runways for airports to support the new jet aircraft being rolled out, bunkers for major communication hubs for the Nazi leadership, and building of armaments factories. Thousands of half-Jews received their National Labour Service letters, compelling them to present themselves to collection centres. Conditions of the camps were similar to concentration camps, and the workers were treated as slave labour. Many perished due to the harsh conditions and the hard work. Understanding the background of my grandmother's cousin's family and all they had been exposed to in Nazi Germany, it made sense when I learned that my grandmother's uncle was involved in the German resistance movement. He was part of an organisation called Free Germany, little known against the more famous acts of resistance like within the White Rose, which was the group of university students from Munich who handed out anti-Nazi pamphlets, and they were all famously executed. And also, of course, we know about the assassination attempt on Hitler by Klaus von Stauffenberg and supported by the military elite. So I was quite intrigued to learn that there was no overarching, united or coordinated resistance movement in Germany, like in many other countries such as Italy, Poland or France. And the National Committee for a Free Germany was actually founded in the Soviet Union. And using radio broadcasts, pamphlets and newspapers, it urged Germans to fight against the Nazi ideas and regime and promised a democratic Germany once the Third Reich was brought down. The resistance was supported by Stalin and Soviet Russia, who of course wanted a Germany free of Hitler and fascism. Free Germany brought together a loose collaboration of resistance fighters and groups, many with communist leanings, but also ordinary everyday people who believed that what the Nazis were doing to Germany and its people was wrong. It was while involved with Free Germany that my grandmother's uncle orchestrated the escape of Soviet POWs from the Sachsenhausen concentration camp just north of Berlin, and also in hiding child flak helpers, some as young as 12, who had deserted their posts at anti-aircraft positions across Berlin in the late stages of the war. I assume that my grandmother's uncle's connection to Russia through his wife had something to do with his involvement in this type of resistance. I only wish that there had been some kind of family stories about this, but sadly, there's now nobody left to ask. So Sachsenhausen was primarily a camp for political prisoners and dissenters to the Third Reich, especially communists, and many Soviet Red Army officers and soldiers were sent here from the Eastern Front. The Soviet soldiers were treated with brutality. Their rations cut to less than the other prisoners. They were left starving with no warm clothes and beaten for no reason. The political commissars and any active Bolsheviks were singled out for the worst treatment. More than 10,000 were executed, shot with a single bullet to the head. Not even high-profile prisoners like Stalin's son escaped such treatment. He was shot dead by Nazi guards one evening while taking his daily walk. Other Russian prisoners were involved in medical experiments, trialling various drug cocktails, or gassed to death as the SS tried more efficient execution methods before the advent of the gas chambers used in the death camps such as Auschwitz. I was very proud to learn of this family's resistance to the Third Reich and their commitment to help those persecuted by the Nazis. I wanted to learn more about other acts of resistance from the time that my story starts, and I was fascinated to read about the Rosenstrasse protest in February and March of 1943. This was a peaceful protest by wives and mothers of about 2,000 Jewish men in mixed marriages and half-Jewish sons, who were rounded up in Berlin despite the protection of their marriages, and they were detained. The last major deportation of Jewish people had just occurred, with reports that these people had been sent straight to Auschwitz. These women wanted information about their men and stood silently, refusing to leave in the face of being threatened with lethal force by police officers and guards with machine guns mounted on trucks outside the collection centre. The men were all released from captivity by the 6th of March, and most then survived the war. However, interestingly, the intentions of the Gestapo at this time have remained a contentious issue. It has been reported that these men were never in danger of being sent to Auschwitz or the camps in the East, that they were in fact earmarked for labour camps across Germany. It was also interesting that these men were released at a time when German morale and general faith in the Nazi government was low after the German losses on the Eastern Front at Stalingrad, and the Nazis just couldn't afford another PR disaster. This was the first protest against deportations of the Jewish people, and the fact that these women protested in the face of violent reprisals and were not forcibly removed shows the power of resistance, particularly at the right time, and the bravery of these women who stood up against their oppressors. I absolutely had to include this in my story, and I've placed Susie amongst the action. Researching the role of child flak helpers, I learnt that they were auxiliary helpers for the Luftwaffe personnel who manned the anti-aircraft flak towers across strategic and major city positions in Germany, and were essential in the defence against Allied air raids. These teenagers learned how to handle and move munitions and how to operate and man the anti-aircraft guns. I could only imagine what they went through as the Allied planes flew overhead and bombed parts of Berlin. There were 3 massive flak towers built across Berlin to protect the city. The one that captured my imagination was the Zoo Flak Tower at Tiergarten, which was the last flak tower to fall to the Soviets in April 1945. It was a huge concrete fortress built to protect the government district and situated within the parkland that surrounded the Berlin Zoo. Not only did it house the armaments for the rooftop anti-aircraft guns and the personnel to man them, but there was a bunker large enough to fit 15,000 Berliners, and it accommodated an 85-bed military hospital on the 3rd floor. On the 2nd floor, however, there was a climate-controlled room that contained priceless artifacts from the city's museums and galleries. And there was also capacity for a command facility for those in charge of the defence of Berlin. And this is where the headquarters of such Nazi leaders as Goebbels was situated. But I couldn't help but find out more about the nearby Berlin Zoo and how it fared during the Battle of Berlin. They were the Allied bombings that occurred in November 1943. I discovered that the zoo was hit by a number of bombs, which caused fires to break out across the zoo, burning the shelters of the elephants, the monkeys, and predators. And also about a third of the zoo's animals perished, including 7 elephants, a black rhino, a chimpanzee, an orangutan, giraffes, pygmy hippos, and half the antelope and deer. Carcasses of dead crocodiles were found on the street outside of the zoo, flung out after the explosion, and had either died from the blast or from the extreme cold. Rumours spread across the city of dangerous animals roaming the streets, but only a few monkeys, birds, and a dingo who was recovered escaped. Among the survivors was the gorilla Pongo, who had been in the zoo since 1936 and had appeared on the cover of the visitor's guide. But sadly, only one of the elephants survived in the badly damaged elephant shelter. Siam the bull survived the war, but lost his entire harem in that one raid. Kanalchki, the 6-month-old bull hippo, also survived, and he became a crowd favourite, siring 35 offspring and living a long life. So while Siam the elephant and Kanalchki the hippo both remained at the Berlin Zoo for the duration of the war, many of the remaining animals were taken in by a number of generous zoos. What amazed me, though, is that the Berlin Zoo somehow remained open to the public until April 1945, so right at the end of the war. So I really had to include the Zoo Flak Tower and the Berlin Zoo in my story. And again, Susie was placed within the action of these 2 fascinating places. Of course, I had to research about the Soviet occupation of Germany after the war, and also about the occupation of Berlin. The Red Army arrived in Berlin and the eastern part of Germany in 1945 before the American and the British forces. This area became the Soviet zone, which ultimately became East Germany in 1949. Major land reforms were initiated across the Soviet zone, where lands and agricultural assets belonging to previously active Nazi Party members and leaders, war criminals, and those owning greater than 100 hectares were expropriated. Many properties were transferred to the Soil Fund by the Committee for Land Reform, broken into small allotments of about 5 hectares, which were then redistributed to landless farmers, agricultural workers, and refugees from Poland. Some were left as central state-run properties and cooperatives, where resources, farm machinery, and equipment were pooled and shared among the smaller holdings. This expropriation affected thousands of Germans who had ancestral estates that had been in their families for hundreds of years. They were expelled from their homes and became part of the massive displaced population that had been forced from part of Poland and Russia that had been Germany prior to the end of the war. When the Berlin Wall fell and Germany was reunified in 1990, part of the agreement between the Soviet Union and Germany involved no recourse for those German families whose properties had been expropriated by the Soviets. So that meant there was no chance for them to claim the property back or compensation for their loss, even after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the emergence of the Russian Federation. So connections to hundreds of years of family history were lost, places where German families had lived, worked, and died for generations. So the Soviets actually reached Berlin first in April 1945, and they stripped the city of anything useful it could use for reparations, sending it back to Russia. The war had already destroyed so much of Berlin, but still infrastructure like railways, transport, and industry were dismantled, not just in Berlin, of course, but across the Soviet zone. And this was before the Americans and the British took over their sectors of Berlin in July 1945. Although surrounded by the Soviet zone, Berlin was actually split into Soviet, American, British, and French sectors, initially governed together as a unified Allied control council. But this soon deteriorated until each sector was then governed independently. The Soviet sector, which eventually became East Berlin, suffered from lack of facilities. And in this story, this is highlighted by the state of the hospital system, many being bombed out or dismantled. The city was a disaster area with poor sanitation, no electricity, heating, running water, and thousands of homeless. Refugees from the east flooded into Berlin too, and infectious diseases such as typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and typhoid fever began to rise, especially in the refugee camps. To make matters worse, venereal disease was also on the rise after the frenzy of rapes on Berliner women and girls by Soviet soldiers in the final days of the war. However, the problem in the Soviet zone was that penicillin was in short supply, and the public health problems in this area were massive and took quite some time to combat. And I certainly touch on this with Susie's nursing background in the story. This is a slide of family members in Germany. This is ultimately a story about family and legacy, what a family will do to stay together, what a family will do to protect its own. In the prologue and epilogue, Ingrid and Natalie, living in Sydney, learn about their family connections to Germany and to Susie, and they read her letters which tell the story of her life, her legacy to them. It mirrors the legacy for me as I learned about this branch of my grandmother's family and how I now can share their story with members of my own family. Like in The Girl from Munich, the common theme running through the war years was of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in extraordinary times. And this is certainly also the case in Letters from Berlin. I'm proud to share this story and honour this family's memory. And I hope with this story to offer a perspective of the war that people may not have seen before, giving insight into how those in mixed marriages and their children lived under the yoke of the Third Reich. But being a story about family and legacy, I know that many readers will be able to relate to the experience of learning about family, especially with the fracture and dispersal of so many families across Europe after World War II. It's often after the generation who lived through the war has gone that their descendants want to learn more and search for pieces to their family's story, perhaps even discovering relatives across the world like I did, and maybe even bringing families back together in some way. I've been privileged to be able to share stories of my family members. I've been delighted to hear from readers who have similar family stories or those with similar backgrounds who knew little about the times of their parents or grandparents and what their lives might have been like. And I feel privileged to be able to share light on other people's stories too. I love that many have shared their own or their family stories, and that's always been the real honour. For me, as a writer and a lover of history, it doesn't really get better than that. I think that fictionalising family stories allows us to bring our characters together, our characters to life, make them flesh and blood, make them real and ordinary like the rest of us. And at the end of the day, I think that's what intrigues us the most. The lives of ordinary people touched by the events of their time. It's their very human and often inspiring actions and reactions that make us believe in humanity and help us understand who we are. Our ancestors' stories are their legacy and ours too. If we learn about them and share them, passing them on to future generations, we'll never forget their stories, who they were, and in turn, where we come from. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that very in-depth presentation about your research. And just looking at the Nuremberg race laws classification document is absolutely fascinating to be able to get that primary resource. Did that involve actually going to a museum, or how did you find that?
You know, the internet is an amazing thing these days.
Yeah.
You can find, if you dig deep enough and long enough, you can find all sorts of amazing resources. And we are just so blessed to be able to do that these days. I can imagine back in the old days how difficult it must have been to source information, and you'd have to go to great lengths. We're very, very lucky these days that we don't have to. So no, it was thanks to a Google search.
That's just fascinating that they actually documented all of that so strategically. And
yeah, it was bizarre when I found it. I couldn't, it gave me chills looking at that, to think it was just so straight down the line, so calculated and cold, you know.
Yeah, so matter of fact about people's lives.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm just going to ask some questions about your own writing now. You've given us a lot of history as well as your research process.
Yep.
But going back to the start, you said in an interview that Fiona McIntosh was a big influence on your writing. Can you tell us a little bit about the masterclass and your time in Adelaide?
It was absolutely amazing. I had been writing for a while before I went to Fiona's masterclass, and I'd got to the point where I couldn't take my writing any further. And I was very lucky to have done a one-day workshop with her in Canberra some years before, and remembered what a fantastically passionate presenter she was, and obviously so full of amazing information. And when I came across her masterclass, I absolutely knew I had to do it. And I still had 3 smallish children at home, so it was a big deal to leave them at home for 5 days and come across to Adelaide and do the masterclass. And the absolutely wonderful thing was not only learning about writing skills, about, you know, the nuts and bolts of writing, about dialogue and characterization and structure and all of those wonderful things. But I went there to find out whether I could actually really write or whether I was just being delusional. The wonderful thing,
you know the answer to that now.
I was very lucky. Well, it was Fiona that helped in that process as well. She actually read a small piece of our writing, and look, she took each member of the class aside and talked us through what our strengths and weaknesses were. And she said to me, look, you know, you can write. And I went, yay, I can write. That's great. She goes, I was writing young adult fantasy at that stage, which had sort of morphed over the years as my children were young and then started to grow older. She said, look, that's probably not going to fly at the moment. Is there something else that you're wanting to write? And because she's such a wonderful historical novelist herself, she'd given us lots of intriguing and fascinating information about her writing process and about the research that she had done. I said, look, I've always wanted to tell my grandmother's story. And I told her a bit about what had happened with my grandmother during the war. She went, oh my God, you absolutely need to go away and write that. And I pitched that very story idea already on that 5-day masterclass and to the publisher. And then I went home and started writing The Girl from Munich. So it was a beautiful, tight-knit group of like-minded people at the masterclass. I felt like I was really amongst family, and everyone's very inspiring and very supportive. And I wouldn't be where I am today without Fiona McIntosh and the masterclass.
Thank you. Yeah, and your family, of course. In your dedication, you mention your family, and it's just very touching. As the first page, it's very obvious that family are important to you.
Yeah, most definitely. And I guess the whole story is about family. My immediate family, of course, is very dear to me, but learning about extended family and distant family. And I guess that part of that too, coming from migrant background. So both my parents came to Australia as children in the 50s. My mum's German, my dad's Italian. They both have really strong sense of family. And I think a lot of people do too that migrate to another country because they've only got themselves and they are very strong knit little group. So that sense of family has always stayed with me.
Yeah, and you managed to balance that, having 3 children and you're writing at the same time. So can you tell us a little bit about how you structure your day that allows you to commit to both of those passions?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'm lucky now that my children are a bit older.
Yeah.
So I've got 3 teenagers now. But that means that they're actually a lot more independent. So I'm quite lucky to be able to write full time. This is my job now. I'm very lucky. And so once they're off to school, I get them all sorted in the morning, and they're off to school in their daily activities. And then I manage to sit down at my writing desk sort of around 9 in the morning, and I write pretty well for the day until it's time to collect them of an afternoon or receive them at home. And then their afternoon activities start, and the rest of the day and evening are then dedicated to my family. So I'm quite lucky that I have that good space in the middle of the day to focus on the writing. And I'm very lucky, actually.
That's great. In your acknowledgements, you mention the readers, and you also mentioned this in your presentation, that lots of readers have contacted you to share their stories.
Yeah.
What is it that's so touching about that process for you?
Well, first of all, that someone would bother to get in touch with me and tell me that they resonated with the story that I'd written. And look, for me, that's the most important thing, is that I wanted to write an authentic story of experiences of people at that time, and for people to say to me that they did feel that was an authentic story, that they had similar experiences, that it brought back memories of when they were going through, say, the immigration process with Suitcase of Dreams, or hearing stories about World War II from their parents and their grandparents, and how important those stories are to them. I think that's so important to me. There are so many stories out there. We are essentially a country of immigrants at one time or another. And I think we have lots of very diverse family stories. And to hear people share their personal stories, I think that's such a personal and intimate thing to do. And I felt really, really blessed by that. And knowing that people are trying to follow up on their family stories and find out further information, and even knowing that with some people who knew very little about what their parents and their grandparents' lives might have been like, that this offered a little bit of a glimpse to them, that they didn't have those family stories to fall back on. That really touched me quite a lot.
Yeah, in a recent interview, you said that sometimes the thing you find most difficult about writing is when you have to dig deep into that emotional scene. How do you give yourself the space, the headspace and the emotional space to dive authentically into that emotion? And you get it so right. I cried in the first 3 pages, I think. So how do you do that? How do you get into that?
You know, sometimes it comes.
Yeah.
Sometimes it just comes. The scene is there and you know exactly what you need to write. But sometimes the emotions are quite difficult to write about. And you may have read that I've mentioned about writing in Suitcase of Dreams about Eric's death and how difficult that was for me, because it reminded me of my grandfather's death and when my grandmother was going through the grieving process afterwards. So it brought back a lot of, you know, childhood memories, I guess, and feelings. And it was quite hard to dig to that level, to find that that grief and how a woman would respond to the death of her husband. And that's really for any of the big emotions that I write about in all 3 books. Sometimes I need to do a first draft and then go away and have a little think, or maybe go and do something different. And you really do have to be in the right headspace to write such an emotional scene. Look, I cry when I write these sorts of scenes. I blub like a baby. But that's
Does that mean it's authentic for you then?
yeah. That's the only way to get it out on the page properly, I feel. And you have to go there to make it real. And sometimes, you know, you don't want to do that, but that's what you need to do.
Yeah. And I noticed in one of your blogs you put a photo up of an inspiration board. Do you always use an inspiration board when you're writing a novel?
Yeah, well, especially the first 2 books, and look, even with Letters from Berlin, I've had so many lovely, wonderful photos, family photos from my grandmother. They were fantastic. They were definitely inspiration. So it was really easy to put an inspiration board together. And as I say, even with Letters from Berlin, there have been a few lovely photos and just little things that just capture your imagination, that you know, to bring you back to the essence and to the focus whenever you look at them. Yeah, it's just something that I've organically done, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Just to our attendees who are zooming in, if you've got a question for Tania, please enter that into the Q&A box. I wanted to ask you about the cover design. Did you have much to do with this, or how did it all come about?
No, I didn't have much to do with that. The wonderful, wonderful designers at Simon & Schuster have put this all together. And look, as you know, it follows on the design from the very first book, The Girl from Munich. And I love the colours, and they're just such dramatic covers. I'm looking at them here while I'm talking to you. And the first time I saw the very first cover from The Girl from Munich, I went, oh my God, this is just perfect. And yes, I haven't really had to put much input in at all, and I've just been blessed that they knew instinctively what was right for these books, and I love them. They're just gorgeous.
Yeah. And of course, I have to ask, what's the next project for you?
Okay, I'm working on something a little bit different this time. Look, I'm still setting this next novel in and around World War II. But I've now turned to my father's family for a bit of inspiration. So as I mentioned earlier, my dad's Italian and he comes from southern Italy. So not that long ago, it might have been a couple of years ago, he was telling me a story about how his father had served in the Abyssinian-Italian War. I knew nothing about, first of all, my grandfather serving in any war, and second of all, about the Italian-Abyssinian War. So that's now Ethiopia, of course. And that was in 1935 when Mussolini was in power. So the inspiration was really just this fantastic idea of my grandfather serving in this war. So the next book is set in southern Italy, leading up to World War II, into World War II. And I was fascinated to learn that Italy's experience of war was very different to a lot of the rest of Europe, and particularly, say, to Germany and Britain. They, in fact, had 2 wars as such. In the beginning, they sided with Germany, and then in 1943, Italy was invaded by the Allies. The British and the American forces came up through Sicily. And essentially what happened then is it split Italy into two parts. And Italy was in civil war with the Allies in the south, and in the north with the fascists and Mussolini. So it was a very different experience of war. And I loved exploring southern Italy and Calabria with its massive mountains all the way to the sea. It was very wild, very isolated, very ancient, and how people in this small pocket of the world viewed the war and everything that unfolded afterwards. So that's what the next story is basically about. So it follows right through those war years and then into post-war as well, and looking at some of the immigration story after.
And it sounds like a story that you can get your research teeth into, like you enjoy so much.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been fascinating. I love the research almost as much as I love the actual writing, being a big history buff. So yeah, it's been fascinating and learning lots about my Italian background and heritage as well.
And are you still doing the same process of having a skeleton of the story and then building the story around that, rather than being the fly by the seat of your pants, which I understand Fiona McIntosh does. She just makes it up as she goes along.
Yeah, I wish I could be like that. And look, some days it does happen a little bit that way for me, but no, I need to have the basic skeleton and know where I'm working towards. Although some days I'll end up somewhere totally different at the end of the day than I thought I would be. And that's the wonderful creative juices when they happen. But yeah, look, this one, yes, I also did plan with a skeleton, and a lot of it was based on historical events with the planning of the major points in this story, primarily because I don't have a lot of family stories to draw on this time. Unfortunately, both my grandparents have passed, and the family members that are left don't have a lot of family stories from the war years in Italy. So it's a lot more fictionalized this time around.
Thank you. And thank you so much for spending the time with us tonight through Burnside Library. And we would absolutely love to host you at Burnside. If the situation it becomes better and in the future when you're ready to release your next novel. So think of us. Over here down south.
Would love to come. That would be lovely. Thank you, Kate.
You're welcome. And it's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you tonight, especially the historical background that you've got into for the story is just phenomenal. So congratulations.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining in and listening this evening. I really appreciate it.
So to our listeners tonight, thank you for zooming in with us online. And we hope that you've enjoyed your time with Australian author Tania Blanchard. Don't forget to follow Burnside Library on Facebook and Instagram, and keep checking our website for upcoming author events. Good evening, everyone. So Tania, I'll just need you to click the stop broadcast button for me as host. And thank you, everyone.
Yeah, has that happened? No.